Good morning, and thank you for that unanticipated warm welcome. A sincere welcome to each of you to a conversation this morning that I know is going to be thought-provoking, compelling, and exciting. My name is Fern Snart. I am the Dean of Education at the University of Alberta, and I am delighted, actually I'm honored, to be hosting this morning. With me are Chris Wells, who is the Director of Programs and Services at the Institute for Sexual Minority Studies and Services, ISMS, at the University of Alberta. He's also a faculty member in our Faculty of Education. Chris is to my immediate right. And special guest today, Wade Davis, Executive Director of the You Can Play organization in New York City. At the outset this morning, I wish to acknowledge the Association of Canadian Deans of Education, ACD, an amazing group of colleagues who have been completely supportive of this, of sponsoring this session since the idea was first born. I'd like to express warm thanks to Katie Ellsworth, the Executive Director of ACD, who has done so much of the heavy lifting patiently behind the scenes towards making this session happen. To the Federation for the Humanities and Social Sciences, thank you for your stellar support and co-sponsorship, and to the Canadian Sociological Association for also co-sponsoring this session. To our AV experts today, Ken and John, for meeting us early and basically setting us up when we needed them so beautifully. It has been suggested that schools and sports are the final strongholds of tolerated homophobia and transphobia in our society today. Our theme for this morning's conversation, and we hope to include you in this conversation a little later in the hour, is casual homophobia. And Chris and Wade will be sharing two unique and innovative perspectives on how this can be addressed with a focus on schools and sports. Chris will discuss the Institute, ISMS's groundbreaking No Homophobes project, which brought with it unprecedented global attention, and Wade will speak to the amazing impact that You Can Play is having on the sporting world. Most of you would probably be aware of this through recent and quite consistent media reports of success stories of You Can Play. I'd like to kick off by sharing a brief story that I think provides the backdrop for the partnership between ISMS at U of A and You Can Play. ISMS launched about a year ago now an endowment campaign, sorry, and one of the people we contacted, thank you, was Brian Burke, at that time with the Toronto Maple Leafs, now with the Calgary Flames. Brian and his son Patrick, to honor their son and brother Brendan, had developed the You Can Play initiative, and we saw many parallels between the work of You Can Play and the work of ISMS. Brian, to our surprise and joy, consented to meet with us, and he was exceptional. Some of you who are aware of him may also be aware of his reputation as being pretty gruff, and so I wasn't sure what to expect. He was magnificent. He spent a lot of time with us. And one of the things, for those of you who also know Alberta and our reputation, that really surprised him is that this major work, which is happening through ISMS and the province, is happening in Alberta. One thing led to another. Brian became an honorary campaign committee member for ISMS. And for all of us, as you know, we can't do this work without allies. People like Brian Burke, Olivia Chow, Katie Lang, Mark Tewksbury have all signed on to our honorary committee to support us. And actually that makes a huge difference in terms of taking us places that we couldn't go without their help. Through Brian Burke, we met Patrick Burke, who is his son, and now the Director of Player Health and Safety with the National Hockey League. We also met Dr. Wade Davis, who is the current executive director of You Can Play. And I have to say, I hope, Wade, this is the first time you've been introduced with that title. Wade well-deservedly received an ONDOC recently, and maybe he can tell us more about that later. And I also have to say that if you happen to have a copy of the most recent People magazine and you flip through it, you're going to see Wade in that magazine. So it's great PR for the work, and we're getting to see him in person today. In February this year, Isthmus and You Can Play signed a partnership agreement at NHL headquarters in Manhattan. And today, actually, is one of the first samples of the ways that we're going to be working together. And another partnership initiative, actually, that came through that initial meeting is a unique new postdoctoral fellowship through the Faculty of Ed at the University of Alberta, where the focus will be enacting research with You Can Play in a number of ways to address the problem of casual homophobia in sporting communities. We have just begun recruiting for this postdoc position, so we think it's probably unique in the world and hope that you'll tell your friends. The You Can Play project has forged groundbreaking alliances with the NHL Players Association, the National Football League, and a growing number of professional and amateur sporting organizations to take a united stand against homophobia and transphobia. Under the leadership of Wade Davis, the pace of change has been extremely dynamic. Many of you would be aware of Jason Collins coming out and playing as the first active and openly gay professional athlete in team sports as a member of the National Basketball Association's New Jersey Nets. Recently, Michael Sam was drafted as the first openly gay National Football League player. What might surprise you is the backstory of how Wade and You Can Play were there every step of the way with these athletes and countless others at both amateur and professional levels, not only supporting the individuals, but also providing the training for teams and coaches to help break down the barriers that have kept LGBTQ athletes silent and invisible for far too long. At Isthmus, with directors Dr. Andre Grace and Dr. Kristopher Wells, we have been working directly with sexual and gender minority and allied youth for over a decade through the application of research to all of our programs and services, to Camp Firefly, which now has locations in Edmonton, Calgary, Saskatchewan, and we're looking at BC and Ontario, and Firefly in Schools, which operates all year round. In 2013, Firefly in Schools provided over 150 free workshops in junior and senior high schools in Edmonton and Calgary and reached over 4,000 youth in their classrooms. Through the Family Resilience Project, we work with our registered psychologists to help families learn to come to terms with and eventually accept their LGBTQ children as gifts to their families and indeed as gifts to our society. Enough from me, let's turn to our presenters. We talked about doing this session as a kind of Oprah Winfrey, when you know what that makes me. So I think we're going to modify that a little, but still also stick to it a little bit, whereby I will pose questions, and then we're going to ask you to feel free to pose questions. But first of all, we're going to let Chris kick off. And first question to Chris is if you can perhaps tell us about the genesis of and the impact of nohomophobes.com.
Thanks, Vern, and thanks, Wade, for joining us this morning, and thank all of you for attending. We know how full and busy Congress is, especially on a lovely day when we're, I'm sure, all across Canada emerging from the throes of too long of a winter. It's a real pleasure to be here with you this morning. What I hope to do is, in the next 15 or so minutes, just briefly sketch out a little bit about the research that we were seeing that led to the development of the nohomophobes.com project, how it started, what we've been learning and where it is now as an introduction to some of our dialogue. And particularly, as Fern mentioned in her introduction, there's been much conversation around schools and sports as being seen as one of the last bastions of tolerated homophobia and transphobia in our society. And to try to get at some of the underpinnings and the workings of why that is. Why do we see this problem of casual homophobia being so prevalent in those environments? So the NoHomophobes.com campaign really is focusing on raising awareness about power and the usage of homo-negative language. In the common vernacular, we're talking about casual homophobia, but really what we're talking about is the homonegativity, and some of the distinctions, as we've seen, are between homophobia, which a lot of people react to in a very negative way, saying I'm not homophobic, but really getting at that concept of homonegativity. And the question we're asking is, why is casual homophobia one of the most commonly heard derogatory language used in schools today, but the least addressed? So the problem of casual homophobia has been well documented in the research literature across Canada, the United States, and in the UK with large climate surveys of LGBT youth. So we see in Canada that 70% of LGBT youth report hearing phrases like "that's so gay" every day. In GLSEN, that jumps up to 85%. And quite surprisingly, almost every youth reported hearing that language, and you can see some of the vernacular that's used that has some different cultural contexts. But it is a clear and pervasive problem, yet there are few resources that have been designed to raise awareness or target interaction, particularly at a school-based or sports-based level. So in addition to the clear and pressing research that's been done, we've also been hearing directly from youth who are being impacted by casual homophobia through our Camp Firefly program, but through many of the youth that we're working with in GSAs. Just earlier last week, I was in Lethbridge working with the Lethbridge School District, public school district, and working with their GSAs in the morning and school administrators in the afternoon. And every single group of their student leaders in that district talked about the problem of casual homophobia and what it does to them when their teachers don't address it. And not only their teachers, but they also talked about their coaches. Many of the coaches who aren't teachers, but who are volunteers, who are perpetuating this language. Interestingly, the eGale study with Dr. Catherine Taylor at the University of Winnipeg showed that 10% of the time it was the teachers who were using casual homophobia directly themselves in the classrooms. So it wasn't just the behavior that students were using, but also those who were in charge and entrusted to protect students are the ones who are also using the language. We also see this language being used around dinner tables, in family rooms and in living rooms with parents. Bill Tierney famously talked about 5 seconds of bigotry, how you can say something to someone and within the span of 5 seconds that will last with them a lifetime. And so the example that we give is mom, dad, son, daughter, cat, dog, the quintessential heteronormative family in Canadian and American society sitting around television, and Modern Family comes on the television and dad has the remote because dad always has the remote, and is flicking through and Modern Family comes on and he says, well, look at those faggots, and turns the channel. Now within that span of that 5 seconds, if their son or their daughter is questioning their sexual orientation or their gender identity, they immediately know that their parents, in this case their father, is not a safe person perhaps to talk to about that. So how our language has power and our language has consequences. So this notion of defining casual homophobia is really what we see being targeted at perceived difference, and that perceived diversity or difference being seen as a weakness, that process of othering that happens. We see that the language is demeaning and it is part of validating marginalization. So we know that the language is not benign. We often hear young people say, well, I didn't mean anything by that. But we know that language has the power to shape, create, and regulate identities, to call them forth into being. as Judith Butler might say, a form of linguistic violence, or what we hear about language as symbolic violence, which is oppressive and systemic at many levels. In fact, within schools, seeing how ubiquitous this language is and how often it's not addressed, we might be able to argue that this problem of casual homophobia is a form of structural violence that is embedded in our school system. And there's been an interesting body of research that started to emerge that looks at this language not just as that insensitive expression without meaning, without consequence, but as a form of microaggression, particularly when we're looking at bullying behaviors and the language of bullying, and how much of the language of bullying is based around homophobia and the targeting of difference and the maintenance of power. So the literature that looks at microaggressions talks about how these messages are designed to be hostile, derogatory, or negative slights directed at particularly vulnerable or marginalized groups in our society. And so I actually have hope that we can positively address casual homophobia in our society through some of the successes that we've had in the past with other forms of derogatory language. So it used to be quite common, and many of us will remember this, to say in polite company, "Don't Jew me." And we recognize how harmful a stereotype and a generalization that actually is. Other common ones about "don't gyp me," equating and stereotyping the gypsies, or as we know, the Romani people, as thieves. And we don't hear that language any longer, so we've evolved in our society to see that that's not acceptable. I still think we have a lot of work to do when we talk about our ableist language, the phrases when we talk about something being lame or stupid or wrong, or certainly the R word when young people don't like something, talk about it being retarded. And the devaluation, again, of diversity and difference that plays in our language, where we see a dominant privileging happening through our language, and then a process of dehumanization and stereotypes and marginalization that happens. Perhaps it's not surprising, given the ubiquity of this language, to see that in Canada, of the top 3 most targeted groups for hate crimes in this country, sexual minorities, Jewish people, and black people are the 3 most targeted groups. But of all of the groups that are targeted for hate crimes, the ones that are the most violent in nature are those targeting sexual minorities. So we see not 1 stab wound, but 40 stab wounds through this process of dehumanization, where LGBT people are not even seen as persons, but as objects to be destroyed. And I think there is a connection to be made between the language and the violence that can happen. So we see that these notions of microaggressions are entrenched and pervasive in our conversations. They often are below the level of conscious awareness. They become so ubiquitous, particularly in our school culture, that they're normal parts of conversation, acceptable. So if you're not aware of these behaviors, how do you take action to intervene? We also see that many of these microaggressions, or this casual homophobia, target a person's perceived social value. It has really little to do with their actual sexual orientation, but everything to do with their gender expression and how that's perceived. And we give the classic examples of how it's quite acceptable, and it can actually be a good thing to have a young girl who's daddy's little tomboy. And that's acceptable and celebrated up to a very particular point, usually around puberty. That's how we say, where you have to take off the pants and put on the dress. Otherwise, that language of labeling as a dyke or a lesbo starts to stick. It's interesting how we can have a tomboy, but we can never have a sissy boy in our society. That is always negative, where this association with being a male or a young boy and any sign of femininity is seen as a weakness to be attacked, and how we see language actively construct and regulate those identities. So the consequences of homophobic language, when we ask young people who come to our summer camp program about their experiences, particularly with language, they share these realities, that it makes me even more angry, and since I can't express that anger, it turns inward. So we see the impacts of negative coping mechanisms, minority stress. It requires energy that should be available for other things, like learning in school. It crushes people on the inside. You eventually fade as a person. It changes you. It rots you. I think it absolutely kills my self-esteem and self-confidence. It's emotionally draining to always pretend that I'm someone I'm not. So we often hear about homophobia as being described as a weapon of sexism and that dominant language of bullying, regardless of a person's sexual orientation or their gender identity. What we're trying to do with No Homophobes, and indeed some new resources we've launched with our Alberta government in partnership with the Institute, are resources on homophobic bullying, the importance of naming it and how it can target anyone, and the workings of power and privilege behind it in our schools. But this past year we became the first, I think, Ministry of Education or government in the world, to my knowledge, to produce explicit resources on transphobic bullying, naming bullying based on gender identity and gender expression, to keep this as a part of our ongoing conversation. So the question that we have, and the question that our website picks up is if homophobic language isn't always meant to be hurtful, how often do we use it without thinking? So the focus here is how our silence continues to maintain the status quo, how silence is never neutral, how silence continues to promote inequity. In fact, our silence can be seen to signal our consent in the very act of discrimination itself. So the project really had a few key goals, and they were to begin to investigate, document, and bring newfound public attention to the damaging and what we found to be the shocking and prevalent use of homophobic language online, and also to facilitate a public conversation, to raise a global consciousness and awareness. And for us, we had to think about how are we going to reach young people who are some of the most prevalent users of this language without understanding its consequences. How are we going to cut through the noise and the distraction that exists in our environment? And that's why we decided to go with social media, where increasingly young people are spending a lot of the time, where young people live. So we said we had to go online, and we also wanted to think about a way, perhaps instead of framing social media as something negative, and certainly in our conversations here in Canada around the pervasiveness of bullying and the move towards criminalizing acts of online bullying, thinking about how can we begin to use social media for social good. And that's where our project was born. So I'm just going to flip to the website. So what you're seeing right now is a live stream of Twitter where these 4 words are being tracked right now all over the English-speaking world. So in real time, real tweets with real people. And we settled, as you saw with the research from those school-based studies, on the most common words, derogatory words that young people were using. So we started to look at the word faggot, so gay, no homo, which is an interesting newer word that's emerged out of rap culture, and the word dyke. And so this is since midnight tonight, how many times these words have been tweeted. And as you can see, scrolling below are the people tweeting the language. So you can actually click and go right to their profile. Because people ask us, are these real people? Is this really happening? Are people still using this language? So our goal behind the website was, how do we make something complex simple? And we know that's probably one of the hardest tasks that we can do is to communicate our messages and what we're learning through research in a publicly accessible way that makes people stop and pay attention and ask questions. We also wanted to focus on the power of numbers and to begin to quantify the problem. We know for many, until we see concrete stats, people don't pay attention. We know that language is always contested. So the website, as you're seeing, it doesn't track the context that language is used, and we recognize that is vitally important. Just in the past week, we've seen lots of controversy with the word tranny, and RuPaul, who doesn't object to the use of the word, and we see that language can always be contested even within minority communities themselves. It's always about who has the power to use it, and how is it used, and why is it used. So this is today. And now what you're seeing is the all-time use since this website was launched. July 5th, it started to track in 2012. So almost over the period of 2 years. And you can see what's quite interesting are the spikes that you see on the language. So when you see these spikes, you know something was happening in the world that caused a lot of conversation on Twitter. So we can go back and we can map global conversations or events on the spike of Twitter. So what I find really fascinating sometimes is to watch this during major sporting events like the Super Bowl, where you're also having another real-time conversation about what we can see as often hyper-masculinized environments. We also ended up launching a campaign beyond the website, which I'll share briefly. Technology, I'm just going to have to scroll right through here. There we go. So we did posters with QR codes that were put up across the city. And the goal with the posters was to begin to out these words, to claim space, to provocate, and ask why are we seeing these words used in public so boldly. What surprised me when we launched this website was the word faggot in particular. Many people had said, well, who really uses that word anymore? That's a word that's not used in many nice or positive contexts. And to see by far and away that that was the most commonly tweeted derogatory word of all of those was quite surprising and shocking. So these posters were put up in bus terminals, on LRTs, across campus, and the idea of the QR code to have particularly young people who are using this technology go in and engage with the poster, which the QR code takes them right to the website. So without context, without explanation, the website's not even on the poster. It's to also for them to see the power when they open up their browser and they start to see these numbers and try to make sense of what they're seeing before them. We also put them up in those famous on-campus washroom ads and posters above the urinals and bathrooms, which was very important to us because bathrooms tend to be traditional sites of violence, structural, symbolic, and physical violence. In fact, we know in our schools and in many places in our societies, washrooms are some of the most dangerous spaces that exist. And particularly the young people that we've been working with in the school environment talk about washrooms, hallways, and locker rooms. And of course, the commonality with those is they're sites outside of regular teacher supervision, where this language is prevalent, it's ongoing, it's damaging, and destructive. So in fact, we actually wanted to reclaim these traditionally violent spaces with the No Homophobes project. And so what happened with the sticker, you saw when people saw this graffiti as a site of resistance and reclamation, they would take the sticker and put it up across the city to call attention and to call out the language that was being seen. Here's another example in a bathroom. And so the campaign results thus far since it was launched, we did all kinds of different media to raise awareness. We did a traditional media event. Again, we thought, how do we reach where young people are? So we held our media event rather than at the University of Alberta in the downtown shopping mall at noon hour. And it was quite interesting, and we had the website projected up on a large screen in the mall, and passerbyers who were coming by, again, to interrupt some of the everyday flow of conversation and to bring this language out into the public. We've had over 1.5 million visitors, over close to 5 million page views, and it's interesting to see where the visitors are coming from. You can see a broad global impact in the work of the website. So not just solely North American-based results. And traffic sources. I think this is really important if you're thinking about educational or awareness campaigns, is how are people hearing about the project? And so to me, I learned about this board button. I might not be part of that demographic that's even heard of that before, but you can see that it started through traditional sources of traffic, Facebook and Twitter and Tumblr, and then some new forms of social media, such as the board button, really started to take off over time. News sources, we were quite surprised to see the global response to this, which was picked up all over the world. In fact, it brought the University of Alberta places that had never been seen before, in Australia, in India. We were in The Economist magazine and The Atlantic, interviewed on BBC radio to 6 or 7 million listeners. We feel that if this website had come out even 5 years ago, it probably would have received no attention. But we're in this sort of transformative moment now where we're able to tap into this global consciousness. So, in conclusion, what we see is that the No Homophobes project is not an attempt to censor. That's often a question we ask. Are you trying to censor and eradicate this language from all forms and uses? Or it's more about the attempt to reveal the subtle workings of heteronormativity and homonegativity. Understanding that language is power. Context matters. Our message is simple to young people. It's think before you speak, think before you tweet. Your language has power. Your language has consequences. Casual homophobia is not benign. NoHomophobes.com provides a space for engagement where we want to call out casual homophobia, put it into the open for public discussion. We're not focused on outing the users. We don't have a top 10 homophobes list that comes out, and certainly that was a concern for our university. This was uncharted territory. There was concern. I've never dealt with more offices on the university, but risk management to our external relations, to the president's office, because there is no case law on social media. There was a concern that since we're rebroadcasting defamatory tweets, would we be held liable? And certainly our focus is using this as an educational tool and vehicle. And our response to our university leaders was, well, if we don't do this, who will? A public institution or a public university needs to lead public conversation, not necessarily always follow it. We're in the safest place to do this work. And every time myself, when I'm in the media talking about these issues, not a week goes by that somebody isn't calling the president to have me fired from my job. And I usually take that as a sign of a good week if somebody's called, because I'm doing something right. We can often measure our success by the level of resistance that we receive, because we are challenging these firmly held, deeply held beliefs, not only in individuals, but in our society. And so the last thing I'd like to leave you with is we did a PSA with our partners at Global Television, because again, we wanted to move forward and get this message out on as many platforms as we could. So this is just 30 seconds.
You broke up with me on my birthday. Isn't that unbelievable?
You little think you can get away with this? When she took your phone the other day, that was
That dip totally everything up.
I've got some news for you.
Limp
Sucker. Dumb.
gay faggot.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chris, for the great kickoff. And I just want to add that when calls come in to have Chris fired, it's not my best week. I am delighted to welcome Wade Davis to comment. I'm not sure if he's going to want to stay with the handheld mic or come up. You're going to come up here, great. We're just thrilled that you've taken the time to be here with us today. The session is being taped. It's going to be shared with all of the deans and the folks who aren't able to be here today. But I was wondering if you would mind kicking us off with a little bit of your self-story. People here might not all know that you were a pro athlete, are a pro athlete, and then maybe how that journey brought you to You Can Play. And I've got other questions, if you don't mind. Welcome, Wade Davis.
Good morning. Good morning. I just want to say first, thanks to the University of Brock for having me out. Also to Chris and Fern for being such amazing hosts and mentors. And I use that word mentor intentionally because I've learned so much from you both. I also want to thank everyone else for coming out today. So I want to give you all a hand. I know it's a beautiful day. I brought the sun to Canada, right? So come on, like there was some gorgeous days happening. I just want to say to Chris, your presentation was breathtaking. Honestly, I learned so much in that 10 to 15 minute presentation. Things that I need to get better at, to learn more about. And your website, which I've seen before, it's speechless. Like, I'm really speechless. So as Fern mentioned, my name is Wade Davis. I'm the current executive director of the You Can Play project. We're an organization that does advocacy work with high schools, colleges, pro sports leagues, and of late some corporations to really educate people on how to set culture, about how to create an environment free of homophobia and sexism. And we have really been fortunate to have people really receive and embrace our message. So I'm going to take you through a little bit about my own past story and then kind of pivot to what the You Can Play project is doing now. Fern mentioned I am an ex-NFL football player. I know I'm not that big as you imagine football players to be, but I played for the Tennessee Titans, the Washington Redskins, and Seattle Seahawks, also 2 teams over in NFL Europe. But before all of that, I was a Southern boy. I was a boy that was raised in Shreveport, Louisiana, and I started playing the game of football at around the age of 6 or 7. And interestingly enough, the very first football game I learned how to play was called Smear the Queer. And the game Smear the Queer is a game where you have one football and you throw it up in the air, and the queer has the courage to pick up that ball and run, and the rest of his teammates, or the people who are playing, are trying to smear him. So that was my first understanding of what you did to someone who identified as queer. But it's interesting that that game, the queer, is the most courageous person, which I think speaks to not really understanding the courageousness it takes to identify in this world as LGBT. And as I got older, I moved to Colorado. I went to high school in Colorado, and around my sophomore year was the first time I had any inkling that I may be attracted to someone of the same sex. And I remember leaving school one day after I found myself attracted to another classmate of mine, feeling horrified and frightened, and spent probably the next month watching, I guess you could call it softcore porn, where I was really trying to focus all of my attention on the female, to convince myself that any attraction that I had to the male was all false. And even beyond that, I knew inherently that I couldn't show up in the world as gay. You know, as a young person, being gay was associated with pedophilia. Being gay meant that I was like a woman, that I was weak. So these messages that I heard as a child really stuck onto me. So when I first had an understanding that I could have been gay, I started to do things that I'm not proud of now. And one of the things that I did is I became a bully. In my high school, I was an athlete, and athletes hold a certain level of cachet in schools. So first, I would wear oversized clothing. You know, I was probably a 28 waist, but I would wear probably a 38 size pants. I was a medium T-shirt, but I would wear XXX size shirts because I wanted to put on this image that I was this really masculine heterosexual male. And I thought that policing my walk, my talk, my dress was all a part of trying to show up in the world as a heterosexual man. But worse than that, the bullying behavior that I exhibited was really problematic. And there was a young man at my school, and we'll call him John Smith. And John Smith was actually friends with one of my closer friends. But because John Smith was the only young person at my school that identified as gay, I hated him. I bullied him incessantly. And I never called John Smith John Smith. He was always the faggot John Smith. What are you doing, faggot? Why are you such a faggot, John Smith? And what I realize now is that John Smith was everything I wanted to be. He was courageous. He was fearless. He understood that showing up in the world as vulnerable and being your authentic self was actually a strength. But that was something at that time in my life that I didn't see. No one ever talked to me about how important it was to be your authentic self. And looking back, his fearlessness blinded me of so many amazing things about John Smith. And so for the next 2.5 years, you know, it didn't get better for John Smith. You know, I used my privilege as an athlete, my privilege of someone who had a sharp tongue, to bully and other so many individuals that didn't look like me or wasn't an athlete. And then I went to college, and I went to school in Utah. And it was, and a lot of my friends thought, like, how did you survive going to school in Utah? But actually, Utah was the safest place for me. You know, it was a space where conversations around homosexuality just didn't exist. So I could live invisibly much easier. I could get a girlfriend, and I learned very early on the power of a woman. You know, that only a woman can affirm your heterosexuality. Only a woman could affirm your masculinity, because as we all know, any single man over the age of probably 35 starts to get questions about him, right? So I knew as a college male, as a college athlete, that I had to show up in the world with a girlfriend in order for people to not start to question my sexuality. So the ways that I used women, you know, is also something that's very important when we think about the work that we do to end homophobia and sexism. And the objectification of women is something that we often don't include in conversations of homophobia, but the two are linked. I mean, the two are definitely cousins. So a lot of the work that we're trying to do at You Can Play is to insert conversations of sexism and the ways that sexism really works to inform homophobia by setting up these very strict gender roles, right, that we have to live by in order to show up in this world as male or female. In college, it was an interesting time for me because I remember sitting in a room similar to this, and there was a gentleman that walked in, and it was the first gentleman that I saw who, by his gender expression, by his gender presentation, that I assumed that he was gay. And I spent the next 3 to 4 weeks stalking this young man, just trying to have a conversation with him, trying to understand the lived experience of what it meant to be gay in this world, because those were conversations that I couldn't have with anyone else. I didn't have the courage or thought that it was even possible to ask my mother or my father or my aunts or my uncles or even my friends about, hey, what would happen if you had a gay friend? Like, I didn't think that those conversations would be acceptable. So when you don't have these type of role models, these people who talk to you and create the environment to where you feel safe to show up in this world as yourself. And then I learned about the power of the word in the closet. I don't use that word in the closet anymore. I think there's a certain level of stigma and shame associated with the word closet, right? When I think back to myself, I wasn't in some closet. You know, I wasn't a coat hanger or a smelly shoe, you know, or a monster. I was a human being, right? And the world wasn't safe for me to raise my hand and say, hey, I'm a gay male. So I wasn't in some closet. I was in the world that wasn't safe, that showed up to me in ways where I didn't think that it was possible to be my authentic self. So I used my privilege of being an athlete. I used my privilege that my gender presentation wouldn't cause people to question my sexual orientation. And then I was fortunate enough to sign an NFL contract. So I signed out of college with the Tennessee Titans. And it was interesting because I remember walking into the NFL locker room thinking, wow, everyone bought it. Everyone around me bought it. All of the policing, me being hyper vigilant of everything around me, all of them bought that I was a heterosexual male. And I also thought, wow, how powerful are women? That all I would need is to have a couple girlfriends and people would buy into the idea that I was a heterosexual male. Wow, that's amazingly powerful. And my athletic career was very interesting because in high school, you definitely see words like faggot and gay being used pretty prevalently. The term "that's so gay," I'm a little older than I look because I moisturize a lot, wasn't used a lot when I was in high school. And then in college, the word queer and faggot was used less. And then in the NFL, it's a very different culture. You know, the locker room culture in the NFL, there is no political correctness. You know, all types of conversation happens there. But what's interesting about a locker room, and I say this often to my friends who identify as heterosexual, is that there's this idea that if you insert gay men, openly gay men, into a locker room, it's going to make everyone uncomfortable, right? And that there's this fear that this gay man is going to objectify another man. But what the not talked about secret is that straight men look too. You know, like that is the one thing that's never talked about, right? If you're in a sports gym, if you're in any locker room where there are men who are naked, everyone looks. But just the idea that you insert a gay identified man in that locker room, all of a sudden now it becomes a problem because there's an assumption that he's going to objectify you. And men aren't objectified, are we? Heterosexual men would never allow another man to objectify them. So it's a very interesting dynamic that happens inside of a locker room. And the language that you find in pro sports locker rooms is actually more sexist than it is homophobic. Because you've matured more, you know, like you've been told that you shouldn't use these types of words in public spaces, right? Whereas in high school, the policing isn't there. In college, the policing is just a little more. And in the NFL, I found that the word faggot isn't used as much except for when there's an altercation, right? If there is an engagement of two players, or if you're on a field in a competitive space and another player makes you look weaker or less than, you react to that person by calling them a faggot. Right, and the term no homos is a very new term. As Chris mentioned, it was definitely created in the hip hop era by a rapper named Cameron, which is an interesting thing because Cameron was notorious for wearing pink. I mean he would wear pink shirts, pink furs, pink shoes, pink socks, and he created this term as a way for it to be acceptable for him to wear these types of clothing, right? Because if he would say a certain term and say no homo after it, it meant that he wasn't gay. Or if he wore a certain color, you know, and said, hey, I like this pink, no homo, then it would allow him the space to exist in the world as a metrosexual male. I think the term metrosexual is interesting too, right? Because there's no female equivalent to the term metrosexual, which speaks to, as Chris mentioned also, the ways that maintenance of power happens, right? You know, that straight men who, you know, saw that gay men were dressing in a certain way, the straight men said, I want to dress a certain way as well, but I don't want to be perceived as like gay men, so we're going to create a whole new term for it. We're going to call that metrosexual. Wow, there's no female equivalent, again, which speaks to the pervasiveness of patriarchy and sexism in this country. So after my NFL days were over, I played for 4 years, and I had a couple different knee surgeries. I was still not out. I had yet to tell, really even myself, that I was a gay male. And I was living in Colorado. I went back home, and I wanted to be gay so bad. I mean, I was sick of hiding. I was sick of showing up in the world as someone else. So I did what any self-respecting wannabe gay man would do. I moved to New York City, right? That's kind of what you do. And New York City was the first space where I started to tell people that I liked boys. I would never say the words that I was gay, because saying the words I'm gay still had such a negative association with it. So saying I liked boys just felt different. You know, it just felt safer to me. And then something that happens often, that when you're not out to anyone, is that you create different family structures, right? So I wasn't out to my immediate family, so I had to create a whole new family who I was 100% sure that they would accept me. And that family came in the form of the New York Gay Flag Football League. And it was interesting because it was the first time that I met other gay men who liked sports and who were gay. Because before that, I thought that I was an anomaly. I was like, oh, I remember meeting these guys for the first time. I was like, wow, look at all these unicorns. You know, like they really just, they exist. You know, it was like rainbows everywhere. But it was affirming to me in the most beautiful ways. It was so affirming to me to be around other people who like sports. It was affirming to be able to show up as my authentic self. My partner who's here makes fun of me often because I tell him a story about, I remember singing Whitney Houston's The Bodyguard soundtrack ad nauseum, spinning around singing She's Your Queen, and then thinking, I did that for an entire 20 minutes and I haven't realized I'm gay yet, have I? Right? You know, so it's just really an amazing thing to be able to experience yourself, your authentic self, around people and have that be affirmed. Chris and I and Fern were talking last night, and the lack of images that exist in the world for gay people, you know, really affects the ways that we believe that we're possible. You know, I often say it's very hard to become what you don't see. You know, and even though I did watch Will and Grace on television, I didn't see myself in the Will and Grace show. Modern Family is an amazing show. I don't see myself in Modern Family. So if you don't see yourself, it's very hard to believe that your existence is possible. So I didn't think that my existence was possible. So meeting people who played sports, who were gay, who were lesbian, who were bisexual, who were transgender, it was truly an affirming moment in my life. Then I was fortunate enough to take a job at an organization called the Hedrick Martin Institute. And that was really where my life changed. And I really learned the power of language there. I met so many amazing sheroes and heroes that inspired me and taught me what real courage looked like. You know, to meet a 14-year-old trans female who walks out of her house every day into a world that looks at her with horror, and do that with a smile. That's courage. To risk, you know, to be homeless in New York City at 14 is like nothing you can ever imagine. To not know where you're going to get your next meal from at 14 is like nothing you can ever imagine. I learned what sex work was. I learned that I should never demonize sex work, because when a 14-year-old trans female is living on the street and she doesn't realize any possibilities for her future, her body becomes her only asset. So I realized that, what would I do at 14 and homeless? I may use my body as my only asset. So I learned how to look at life through a very different lens, how to begin my work from the margins, from the people who have the least and not from the people who have the most. That's what I learned at the Hedrick Martin Institute, and it's an organization that caters its services to youth who are mostly identified as LGBT, who are mostly youth of color, who sit at a very different intersection of race, of class, of sexual orientation, you know, of who sit at an intersection that my privileged NFL butt didn't even have to worry about, right? So sitting and talking and learning that HIV is not my problem. It's all of our problems. That we are all living with HIV, that we're all living with homophobia, that we're all living with sexism. That if I don't make it my business to be able to start doing that work, if I don't make it my business to use my platform and my privileges to illuminate their stories, then what am I doing in this world? And then after 2.5 years of being educated in blinding ways, I met Patrick Burke. And as we mentioned, Patrick Burke is from a hockey family. And please, no hockey questions. I know zero about it. I'm learning. I'm trying. But I met Patrick Burke for the first time, and if you all know Brian Burke, Patrick Burke is Brian Burke's son. I mean, he is a twin of his, and Patrick Burke is a straight shooter. He doesn't mince words, and he told me, he said, I'm a straight man running an LGBTQ advocacy organization. What do I know about being LGBTQ? He says, I need you to come and run this organization, to speak to the lived experiences of what it's like to be a player and someone who also identifies as gay. And from the moment I met Patrick, I was inspired by him. Rarely do you meet someone that doesn't just walk and live in their privilege. I mean, that is so very, very rare. Patrick wakes up every day trying to be a better advocate, trying to be a better ally. And I'll be truly indebted to Patrick for trusting an organization that he created in the name of his brother. So I'm truly grateful for that. So I want to show you all a video that we do at the You Can Play Project. There are videos that are done by colleges, high schools, and pro sports teams that speak to our mission. That our mission is not just to create safe spaces for LGBTQ athletes, but for all athletes. Because I don't just show up in the world as a gay man. I show up as a gay black man, right? So if you don't create spaces for people of color in sports that are safe, people of different religions that are safe, from people from different classes that are safe, like that, this is our work to do that we don't live these monolithic lives, that all of our lives intersect at some point. So our work is really to create the type of sports environment where everyone can show up as our authentic self. And one of the reasons why I think we're so successful with the work that we do is that we don't tell people that what they believe is right or wrong. Our goal is to create a conversation where we can all expand in consciousness, where I can learn from you and you can learn from me, and we can both lean into each other and build bridges and not build dams. So as you watch this video, please take note of the type of language that's used, the diversity that's used, the inclusiveness that is used. And last thing that I'll say about the word diversity is that historically the word diversity has never meant LGBT. So as you're doing your work as advocates and as allies, remember that when you use the word diversity, your individuals who are LGBT do not believe you're talking about them. You have to be very intentional to say that this is a diverse environment which includes sexual orientation and gender identity. Because when I heard people talking about a diversity, I was like, oh, they're talking about me as a black man, but not as a gay man. So as you start doing your work, as you listen to us talk here, I would hope that we are intentional about our language, but you're also intentional about the work that you do as well.
If you can play, you can play.
We are all part of the U family.
and we embrace, celebrate, and respect all of our members.
It does not matter your race, religion, gender identity, sexual orientation, class affiliation, or background.
All members of our athletic community are valued and respected.
And the unique characteristics of each and every one of our student athletes, coaches, and staff are celebrated.
Gets it inside the
If you can play, you can play.
Creating a safe and welcoming environment allows our student athletes to reach their full potential.
If you can throw, you can throw.
If you can serve, you can serve.
If you can dunk,
you can dunk.
If you can putt,
You can putt.
Miami is committed to building a supportive environment for all of our student athletes.
In order to be excellent in all that we do, the U family values and celebrates all forms of diversity.
If you can play, you can play.
If you can do a front 2.5 with 2 twists,
then you can do a front 2.5 with 2 twists.
If you can dribble, you can dribble.
If you can run, you can run.
If you can swim, you can swim.
Miami is committed to its core values of excellence, integrity, passion, family, and respect.
In addition, we're committed to developing young people on the field, in the classroom, and in life.
We do all this in an environment that celebrates all members of the U family.
Regardless of race, religion, gender identity, sexual orientation, class affiliation, or background.
If you can play, you can play.
If you can play, you can play.
Miami is a community in which we welcome people from all backgrounds. Diversity is not just a word here at the U. It has real meaning. If you can play, you can play.
If you can play, you can play.
Wow. How can you not be inspired? How can you not know how important it is to keep going? And how can we not be grateful to Chris, Wade, Jeff for coming, to each other for keeping this work vibrant, for keeping it going? I can't say enough, except that we do have a couple of minutes for questions from you if you have them. I'll do my best when I change my glasses. But I see a hand. I'm going to just repeat the question, should I? Quick question to Wade, and this is for what's being recorded. What's it really going to look like in the locker rooms when we start having more and more gay athletes joining the locker room?
So I had the chance to go speak to the St. Louis Rams. I played for Coach Fisher while he was at Tennessee. So after Michael Sam was drafted, I got a phone call from Troy Vincent, who is a senior executive at the NFL, and then he said, "Hey, Coach Fisher wants you to give him a call." So I got a call from Coach Fisher, and he said, I want you to come and deliver the same message that I gave at the owners meeting. I had a chance to speak at the NFL owners meeting. And what I do when I have those conversations is I really try to debunk specific myths that exist around gay athletes. And I also talk extensively about the added value that exists when you have an athlete who is open. And what was amazing about that conversation is one of the first questions that I got from one of the leaders on that team was, how do we make Michael feel safe? You know, and I think from that question is that these athletes get it, like they understand the moment that they're existing in. So one of the biggest issues that I find from talking to straight athletes is that they don't know exactly how to engage with a gay athlete, right? Because they're making these crazy assumptions that gay athletes are just different, right? So we try to have discussions about how do you normalize that type of a dynamic, right? And the truth is, you treat them like you would anyone else. You know, your gay athletes can take jokes, right? You know, like they can be teased and made fun of, and so it's really about two things. How do you get Michael to talk to his teammates about exactly what he's comfortable with, but them to also not see him as different, as other, right? Just the same way that straight athletes don't make fun of each other's mother or call each other really derogatory terms, the same thing goes for your gay athletes. Like, you can treat him the exact same way. So it's really, how do you get them to move from walking on eggshells to showing up as themselves, you know, and to not be hyper conscious that Michael Sam needs to be treated differently, or that he's going to look at them in a sexual way. Like that's really what the environment will look like initially. But I think after, and this may sound crazy, after a week in training camp, when you're with someone from 6 a.m. until 8 o'clock at night, they won't even think about it, you know. And the one thing that Chris and I talked about last night is that I actually believe that athletes are better positioned to be to deal with issues of diversity in the locker room because they always have, right? So when you play on a sports team, every year there's someone new there from a different race, a religion, a class, right, a background. And now, in an open way, sexual orientation, but because you spend so much intimate time together, right, you move through those periods of uncomfortableness a lot quicker, right? Because I'm with you for 12 hours, day after day after day. So if you worked as a librarian and your co-librarian, maybe you spend 2 hours of time together, and you may not actually work together, or your work may never intersect, or you may not have the same common goals. On a sports team, all of that exists. You spend a lot of time together. You have the same common goals. So I think athletes are actually uniquely positioned to be able to move through these periods of uncomfortableness or difference a lot quicker. So what I think that you'll have is that the fatigue factor of working so hard and all of that stuff will actually get them to not be as conscious of the fact that now I'm playing with someone who's gay.
Do we have time for one more? I'm just going to take that as a yes. Yes, go ahead. Please. Can you just quickly paraphrase the question?
Sure. The question was, you know, how do you live and do this work in communities where there is resistance, and keeping sort of the safety, the integrity, and the well-being of all individuals, as Wade said. You know, I think you approach as a conversation, and I think, you know, we have to get beyond polarization. And I think so much of when we're talking about sex and gender in our society and its history is all about polarization. It's all about privileging, you know, as we say, masculinity over femininity, and how they're created in direct, almost opposition. You know, heterosexuality in contrast to homosexuality, as these binaries or polar opposites. But we know that in essence one creates the other. And so I think it's about creating those respectful environments, recognizing that it's not a one-time conversation, it's an ongoing conversation. When I work with schools, K-12 schools and school administrators, and I talk about culture and changing the culture, and to do that you need to change the conversations we're having. But they all tense up because no administrator wants to be responsible for the school culture, because it's the hardest thing to change. It's not one policy, it's not one practice, it's an ethos, it's a way of being, it's those thousands of micro practices. It requires focus and intentionality with that. And I think they're some of the most difficult conversations to have, but they're the most important. And it's never a one-size-fits-all recipe. So particularly in our work in schools, we know that schools, represent, as Wade is saying with professional sports teams, unique communities. And you've got to go in and meet that community where they're at, rather than telling them, the values or the beliefs are wrong. Right away, we all know intuitively the walls start to go up. Wade?
My one piece of advice is that the messenger matters, right? So one of the reasons why I'm allowed to go speak in a pro sports team, right, is because I'm an ex-player, right? So I understand the lived experiences of an athlete. So I'm not going in there with a lack of knowledge about what that culture is like, and I don't go in there with preconceived notions about what athletes are or aren't. So I think, as Chris is saying, also, like as long as you enter that space from not a deficit thinking model, but more of an asset set model, then people typically, or at least willing to engage you in conversation. And if we approach people with the same type of love and compassion that we want in return, then there is oftentimes at least allowance of a conversation.
And Wade's comments just made me think of a phrase from Martin Luther King Jr. who talked about agape, unconditional love and acceptance. And in fact, that was the name of our first focus group that led to our institute in our Faculty of Education 15 years or more ago, was agape, and was about creating that space. Schools and sports as these two dominant social institutions that really try to replicate the status quo. And then what happens when you're trying to challenge and change it? It really is one step at a time. It's one conversation at a time.
I wish we could stay longer, but I know the session time is up and people have others. To each of you, thank you so much for taking some of your conference time to be here, and to our presenters and to Jeff, deepest thanks for who you are and what you do. And perhaps in the hallway there will be a couple of minutes. I'm sure these two, Jeff and Wade, are anxious to get off and helicopter around the falls, etc. But thank you all very, very much.